Matthew Grant arrived home unannounced, the silent automatic gates of his sprawling estate swinging open without the usual greeting. He was supposed to be in Tokyo, locked in a brutal 12-hour negotiation, but the pressure and the deep, persistent loneliness had forced him onto the red-eye flight home. He needed to see his sons. He walked straight to his hidden study, the single room in the mansion where he could monitor everything without being seen. Opening the security app, Matthew brought up the live feed for the grand sunroom, where the boys spent their afternoons. His 3 5-year-old sons, Josiah, Jeremiah, and Jonah, were sitting side by side on a thick rug. Nancy Wellington, the new caretaker he'd hired just 6 weeks ago, sat a few feet away, holding a small, brightly colored wooden train. Matthew leaned in, zooming the feed. He was looking for any deviation from the strict, quiet engagement therapy schedule. He expected only the low whir of their digital communication tablets. Instead, he heard a sound. A clear, strong vocalization. He saw Josiah, his most withdrawn son, point a steady finger at the train track. His small face was concentrated with effort, and he repeated the sound, this time with a definitive tone. "Dad." Matthew's heart stopped. His hands went instantly cold. A second voice, higher and filled with sudden, fierce energy. Jeremiah pointed next, his entire body leaning forward. "Play!" Matthew's phone slipped from his grip, hitting the Italian tile with a light tap. He didn't register the sound. He remained frozen, leaning against the steel of the desk, the man who had accepted 4 years of permanent silence, watching it shatter on a cracked screen in his own home. But hold on for just a moment. If you're feeling the weight of this story already, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? This story is all about the danger of letting fear win. And if you've ever felt like miracle was too far, this is your sign to keep believing. Sometimes they don't ask for permission. They just show up when you need them most. 4 years ago, Matthew Grant lost the guiding star of his life. His wife, Lucy, passed away moments after delivering their triplets. Her death was sudden, cruel, and without warning. Matthew, who controlled a global finance empire, was left entirely powerless, his world dissolving in a sterile hospital corridor. He walked out to meet his sons, Josiah, Jeremiah, and Jonah. 3 tiny infants, 4 years old now, who had spent the entire period in a crushing silence. Within months of their birth, the doctors confirmed the devastating diagnosis. Due to birth trauma and oxygen deprivation, all 3 boys had severe expressive aphasia. They could hear, understand, and feel everything around them, but the pathway to forming verbal speech was profoundly damaged. "Mr. Grant, we must manage expectations," the specialist had emphasized. "We can build communication through digital means, but verbal speech is extremely rare in cases this severe. It is highly, highly unlikely. Prepare for the reality of nonverbal lives." Matthew heard the words, and this time they didn't penetrate. They confirmed the finality he had been seeking since Lucy's death. He was still burying his wife in his mind. The silence that settled over the mansion became a character in itself. Heavy, omnipresent, and isolating. The boys would use frustrated gestures or point to images on expensive, custom nonverbal tablets. They didn't hit speech milestones, and their inability to express emotion verbally became the defining feature of Matthew's life. He hired the best specialists, flew in consultants from around the globe, and purchased every cutting-edge device on the market. Millions spent on a solution that promised to bypass the silence, but only cemented it. Nothing changed. His sons would never call him Dad. He buried that final hope right beside Lucy. The cycle of professionals followed, a long, brutal procession of failure. 15 different caregivers, therapists, and nannies passed through the house in 4 years. Several quit within weeks, stating the atmosphere was too bleak. 2 were caught stealing cash from the safe. One physical therapist, who seemed genuinely kind, ended up resigning after Matthew discovered she was secretly filming the boys for an online documentary without his consent. Each failure pushed Matthew deeper into isolation. He stopped trying to connect. He saw people only as risks, not helpers. He installed high-definition cameras in every room, every corner, watching the footage nightly, searching for the moment of betrayal he was now certain would come. His rigid control was the only shield he had left against further heartbreak. So when Nancy Wellington walked through the door, a composed 26-year-old woman with a quiet, almost unsettling focus, applying for the general care position, Matthew felt a familiar dread, seeing only the 16th mistake, the next in a long line of disappointments. "The parameters are non-negotiable, Miss Nancy," he reiterated, his voice flat. "Strict adherence to the nonverbal protocols. No attempts at verbal coaxing, no stories, no singing, and certainly no false encouragement. We manage their reality. We do not defy the diagnosis." Nancy acknowledged his rules with a simple, direct nod. "I understand, Mr. Grant. I will follow the schedule." But in reality, her understanding went deeper than his instructions. She began speaking to them constantly, not just narrating her actions, but reading worn children's books and rich, descriptive passages, carefully pointing to the words as she spoke them. She whispered words of fierce affirmation when the monitoring equipment was off, telling them they were strong and brilliant. Matthew watched it all through the security feeds, initially seeking a reason to dismiss her, but increasingly compelled by the small, quiet shifts in the room. Josiah, the most withdrawn son, began tracking the movement of her lips. Jeremiah, usually restless, would lie perfectly still when she sang a gentle, foreign lullaby. Jonah held his gaze on her face with an unwavering intensity. Matthew fought the urge to hope, reminding himself that belief was a poison. But he couldn't look away from the woman fighting for his sons with nothing but words and conviction.
Week 7. Nancy had quietly transformed the sunroom into a sensory landscape, filling it with textured fabric, plants, and simple wooden toys, defying the sterile clinical environment Matthew insisted on. One afternoon, Matthew pulled up the footage and saw the latest breach of protocol. Nancy was using flashcards, not for nouns, but for actions and feelings. She held up a card showing a figure running. "Run," she said, articulating the sound clearly and slowly. "Run, run." She did this repeatedly, tracing the word with her finger. Matthew was enraged. This was high-risk, high-frustration work. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over her number, ready to fire her before she could break his son's fragile calm. But then, Jeremiah's small hand lifted. He didn't point at the card. He reached out and gently touched Nancy's throat, where the sound was being made. A tiny raspy sound, an effort at vocalization escaped him. It was close to the R sound. Matthew froze. His entire body went rigid. He rewound and watched it 3 more times. That focused touch, that profound attempt to mimic the mechanism of speech. It was the most intentional effort any of his sons had ever made. Such a simple movement, a tiny gesture, but Matthew knew it was a seismic shift. That afternoon, Matthew left his study and walked straight to the sunroom. He didn't knock, he pushed the door open and stood there, blocking the light. Nancy was still on the floor with the boys. She was holding a flashcard showing 2 children smiling radiantly. "Happy," she whispered, pulling the word out. She looked up when the door opened, her composure absolute. "Mr. Grant, welcome home." Matthew's voice was strained. "The card for run? The card for happy? The verbal attempts? This is explicitly against the protocol. This is inviting catastrophic frustration. What is your justification?" Nancy carefully placed the cards aside and stood up. She looked past Matthew's rage and addressed the core of his fear. "The protocol, sir, is designed to ensure they never try and therefore never fail. That's why it's called management, not therapy. It assumes the silence is permanent. Matthew's jaw clenched. The neurologists. The neurologists, Nancy interrupted, her voice gaining a quiet power. The neurologists gave you a medical projection based on limited resources and fear of liability. They did not factor in the resilience of these boys. They did not factor in the plasticity of the human grain. They told you what usually happens when a father accepts defeat. She took a step closer, not aggressively, but with undeniable weight. Have you ever considered, Mr. Grant, that you are protecting them from the risk of hope, but not from the harm of being perpetually underestimated? They are not their diagnosis. They are waiting for permission to try. The words were a direct hit. Matthew felt the 4 years of suppressed guilt erupting in his chest. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash the fury of a desperate man, but all that came out was a choking sound. Nancy turned gently to Jonah. "You hired me to care for them," she said softly, picking up the happy card. "And I will not care for them by giving up." Matthew watched her resume the session, totally ignoring his presence. He left the room, defeated not by Nancy, but by the cold, hard realization of his own surrender.
That night, Matthew didn't sleep. He sat in his study, but instead of monitoring the feed, he opened his laptop and typed, "5-year-old expressive aphasia verbal breakthrough research." He spent hours consuming articles, videos, and case reports. The science was irrefutable. Early, intensive, consistent verbal input could, in rare but documented cases, stimulate the brain to forge entirely new neural connections. The gentle, rhythmic approach Nancy was using, the one he'd called reckless, was precisely the method championed by the most optimistic, forward-thinking specialists. He was choked by shame. He had been so terrified of false hope that he had extinguished real possibility for 4 years, spending a fortune on equipment while a low-paid caregiver had delivered the only intervention that mattered: belief. He closed the laptop. He walked out of his office and, for the first time in 2 years, walked toward the nursery. He opened the door, and the room was cold and dusty. He looked at the deep-sea mural Lucy had painted, her favorite Bible verse scripted above the cribs. He sank into the rocking chair, pulled the blanket draped over its arm to his face, and breathed in the faint scent of her perfume that still clung to the fabric. "I'm sorry, Lucy," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry I stopped fighting for them. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just hiding." He stood up, the choice made. He immediately began calling the names on his new list: specialists who believed in neuroplasticity, therapists who prioritized verbal immersion. He was no longer running from the impossible. He was running toward the possibility. Thursday afternoon, Matthew sat in his study waiting for the weekly alert. The air was thick with tension. He picked up his phone, opened the security app, and watched the sunroom feed. The image registered instantly. Nancy was sitting on the floor, holding the small wooden train. The 3 boys were close, leaning in. Nancy was repeating simple, key words, her eyes shining with tears. "Tell me," she whispered, "tell me what you call me." Josiah pointed a trembling finger at Nancy. His small face was contorted with the physical effort of forming the sound. He pushed it out, a wet, rough syllable, but clear enough for Matthew to hear it through the tiny speaker. "Da-ah." Then Jeremiah, his face flushed with triumph, repeated the word, cleaner this time. "Play." And finally Jonah, the smallest, the quietest, looked directly at Nancy's mouth, then back at the camera. He lifted his hand to his own lips and pushed out the sound. Da-ah. Matthew's knees gave out. He slid down the wall until he sat on the floor, shaking. His phone lay on the carpet, showing the raw, pure joy on the faces of his sons and the beaming, tear-stained face of Nancy. 4 years of silence, 4 years of impossible, shattered by 2 profound, beautiful words: Dad and play. He pushed himself up, his limbs numb, and stumbled toward the sunroom door. He stopped in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold. Nancy looked up and saw him. his shirt wrinkled, his face a mask of absolute painful joy. She didn't look triumphant. She looked at him with an immense, quiet compassion. She didn't say a word, just watched him with those steady eyes. Matthew crawled forward on his hands and knees until he reached them. He gathered all three boys into his arms, pressing his face against their small heads, breathing in the scent of hope. "I'm sorry, Lucy," he wept, the apology covering every day of his 4-year absence. He looked at Nancy, tears streaming down his face. "You gave them their voices." Nancy gently put her hand on his shoulder. "No, Mr. Grant," she said softly, deflecting the credit. "They gave themselves their voices. I just stayed long enough to hear them." They sat there together on the sunroom floor, a redeemed father holding his speaking sons, a faithful woman who refused to accept impossible. The house felt vibrant now, not empty, not silent, alive. Matthew held his sons tighter and let himself feel the weight of real, hard-won hope. Thanks for watching.